I'm on mute on Zoom. I swear. I try my best to get this thing right. And each time there's something else that pops up. What's going on? Welcome, everybody. Just waiting for folks to come in. I'm lighting my incense, not my incense, it's my sage today. I'm lighting some sage today. Champa, I think it's called. Blue sage. Welcome, Australia. Oh my God, that is so on my list to visit. Cannot wait to get to Australia and New Zealand. Can't wait. Once I get back to Asia. Well, once hopefully me and my partner get back to Asia. Welcome, everybody. Just waiting for some folks to come in. We're going to dive into guilt. If this is your first time here. Okay, we got some Australians in the house. If this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Francis. I never introduced myself, but you get a gist of who I am by just, going through the social media stuff. I won't bore you with that kind of introduction. But tonight we're going to be talking about guilt, which I feel like it's a thing we all go through. I'm going to share some personal stories as well. If you haven't had a chance, make sure you join the Thrive newsletter. Continue the conversation offline. I send curated newsletters every month. I'm thinking of sending more, but we'll see how that goes. But I think a lot of people enjoy the newsletter, so make sure you get on the list. All right. So I think we have enough people to get started. What's going on, Grateful? See if anybody's in so I'm on YouTube and IG. Next week, I usually go live every week on Wednesday at 8:00. Next week, I'll most likely go live on Tuesday. Next week's my birthday, you know what I'm saying? If you haven't noticed all the Libra memes, posting a lot of Libra memes. I usually don't do that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit out of my element, but I think let's have a little fun with the Libra. As I was looking through all the Libra stuff, I was like, oh man, I've evolved a little bit. There's still some things, so some remnants that's still there, a little pettiness. But Libras are a piece of work. All right. So yeah, let's just get started about this whole gate thing. Thank you for watching. If you're catching this on the replay, I appreciate you catching it on the replay. And if this is something that y'all connect with, like working through guilt, working through feelings of guilt, let me know in the chat. I'm feeling myself, Grace, I got my hair did. See how long it lasts. We have a retreat coming up. I couldn't go to retreat looking like, I don't know, yesterday's ham sandwich. So I had to, do a little something with the hair, first impressions and all that. But yeah, welcome. Come on in. What I was saying, but yeah, let's dive into this whole guilt thing. We all have experienced feelings of guilt. Like, I say it's like that nagging companion, that just won't leave us alone. Like, you still here, guilt? Why are you still here? And there's so many different flavors of guilt, right? You got your friend guilt, the parent guilt, family guilt, career guilt, you name it. Guilt is everywhere. And being human means that you are going to deal with some form of guilt, unless you're a sociopath. And that's a different conversation that we're not having tonight. But guilt can be like this never-ending thread that's constantly just weaving itself in and out of our lives. And usually what happens is it causes a lot of suffering, right? And often it doesn't change until we learn how to manage it. And so that's what we're going to do. Today, we're going to dissect guilt a little bit, and then talk about some ways that you can actually begin to just process through and be able to process some of that stuff in a healthier way. So there is healthy guilt, and we'll talk about that. Healthy guilt is usually connected to our values. Like, I'm not going to do something that goes against my core values. And then there's unhealthy guilt, usually connected to some form of trauma, a trauma response where it's excessive, right? You're just constantly feeling guilty for something, guilty for doing something, not doing something, guilty for being, guilty for existing. That is pervasive and it's unhealthy, right? So when we think about guilt, it's not just about like feeling bad. And that's a component of it, because getting that feeling allows us to know that something's off, right? But it goes deeper than that. Often if we don't get a handle with guilt in our lives, it really messes up with our relationships. It messes us up just on our relationship with ourselves. And then it sort of becomes this filter that we see the world through. And it's not always a clear lens. And if you think about the way society is structured, society don't make it easy for us. You know what I'm saying? They don't make it easy. What's going on, Nick Trump? We're talking about guilt. Our society's moral compass is very subjective, if you haven't noticed. I'm going to use this example. I've traveled a lot, and there are some countries who look at dogs not as pets. They look at them as animals. And so they stay outside, my American perspective and sort of my own influence and how I feel about animals. I'm like, oh, pets need to be inside. And so when I go to different countries and that's not what they do, I literally have to adjust my moral compass a little bit. I wouldn't do anything that goes outside of what I believe and what I'm connected to or any of those values. But I have to adjust that moral compass because I'm in a different country. And so I say this to say that like morality is very subjective and it varies from person to person. You kind of think of morality as like a moving target, right? And so because it varies from person to person, there's not this all-encompassing way of sort of managing some of this stuff. But, when we think about guilt, we like to create rules, strict rules, usually around guilt, like what's wrong, what's right, sort of that dualistic language, what's good, what's bad, what should be punished, what shouldn't. We even try to define justice and fairness. And so the problem with like trying to navigate this whole moral maze is that we often get lost in the expectations of society versus our own and how that sort of impacts our own lives. And so we end up not really knowing, what it means for us to take full responsibility or own up to something because we're doing it through this sort of like societal lens, right? And through this collective guilt. That's a huge one that a lot of us have been exposed to or might be feeling to, sort of that collective guilt, and versus looking through the lens of our own personal journeys. And so unless we figure all this out, what it means for us on a personal level, our relationship with guilt and how we fit into the world can become really inauthentic. And over time, those feelings, that constant feeling of guilt is going to erode our sense of self, our self-esteem, and how we show up in the world. And that can be very exhausting. And if that sounds like you, if that's something that you deal with, you can let me know. I'm gonna check any comments over in YouTube. Okay. And one thing about guilt too, if we're not very mindful about its presence, is that it physically impacts us. We already know like emotions impact our bodies. And you could tell like when you feeling guilty, there might be that lump in your throat, the heaviness in your chest, even some of this anxiety in your gut area. And so a lot of that is unprocessed guilt, right? It's attaching itself to your body. And so guilt, eventually, if we don't manage these guilty feelings, they become a frenemy. I call guilt the frenemy. Call it friend because it gives us feedback. Call it the enemy because if we don't manage it, it becomes pervasive. But it becomes our frenemy. It's just always there, like I said earlier, that nagging companion, reminding us of all the things we did or didn't do, or the failed expectations, or where we fell short. And so it is a very tricky balance. Being able to sort of take responsibility, to make amends, while also not allowing these guilty feelings to consume us, right? When you're walking, you feel it. Upon waking, when you wake up, you feel a lot of guilt. Is that what you're saying? Just reading some comments too as I share some of this stuff. Yeah, it can really consume us. We can wake up with guilt and go to sleep with guilt, right? It's just kind of just hovering like a fog around us. And so the big question really lies in how do we find that balance, right? How do we move forward without carrying the weight of guilt all the time in our lives? And the key really here is using that energy, that guilty energy, and we'll get into this a bit later, but learning how to use that to learn what guilt is trying to say versus taking that energy and condemning ourselves, right? Because often when we feel guilty, we begin to just condemn ourselves. We lock away, we throw away the key, you know what I'm saying? We just lock ourselves up and throw away the key, I mean. And, you know, it's really very harsh and unfair of how we're sort of, how we're able to sort of move through the world, because we need to be able to give ourselves a level of grace and compassion and all those things. And so we tend to be our harshest critic, right? We tend to be the ones who don't really give ourselves the forgiveness and grace that we need, but we give it to other people. So we need to sort of switch all that. And so we often just get caught up in our own guilt that I believe we actually do become addicted to it, right? And it's a real thing to be addicted to our own suffering. What's going on, our Black? Because what happens is that we become dependent on that feeling as a mechanism for survival, as a mechanism for identity. And if we don't have it, we actually do experience a sense of loss or this void or this emptiness. And so we cling very tightly to the things that make us suffer, right? And so these defense mechanisms tend to act as this shield. And when it does, it gives us a false sense of protection. So when we don't have them, we actually will become feeling too vulnerable. And that might be very uncomfortable for a lot of folks. And now when it comes to guilt, you got to ask yourself, what kind of identity is it giving you right now? Does it make you feel like a martyr? Does it make you feel like a victim? Does it make you feel worthless, right? And those are some powerful words because they hold a lot of meaning. But it's essential to sort of scrutinize that, because for us to understand some of these more difficult or complex emotions surrounding guilt, because we got the cousin shame and we got all these other things that come along with guilt, we also have to recognize how they have benefited us over the years. And eventually what you can see is that you realize these so-called benefits aren't really healthy at all, right? In fact, they're doing more harm than actual good. So just keep that in mind, and definitely share in the comments. If you're watching this on the replay, let me know what, some of the guilty things that you might be experiencing or feeling, any guilty feelings, anything that you even want to sort of like release. Let me know, and let me see how I can support you with that. So here's the thing. Guilt is a necessary part of our psychological development. It's important. Like it's part of us. And because it gives us an awareness of how we're impacting the world around us. And if you have any questions, feel free to send any questions. But it is our moral compass, guilt, to know, guilt is our moral compass. So to know when we're going outside of our own personal values, when we're going against ourselves, the things that we believe in. And so it's kind of like this, it's a smoke signal. It usually starts off as a smoke signal and turns into a blazing fire sometimes, right? But guilt is not necessarily a bad thing. I don't like to label good or bad anyway, but guilt isn't bad. We often interpret it as something that's bad. It just needs more scrutiny, right? We need to reflect on how we respond as a result of that guilty feeling and how we behave. Like, what are we doing with these guilty feelings, right? We could, like I said earlier, we can spend our entire time condemning ourselves for all these guilty feelings that we have, or we can take a moment to see what kind of learning can we gain from this experience. What's going on, Lily? Sometimes, though, there is another side to all this, and people might not even realize it, but you can actually just pick up on the emotions of those around you, right? And then there are two groups of people. You have those who, take the responsibility. And then you have those that just you have those that avoid taking responsibility. And you have those who just feel guilty, consumed by guilt. So let's go a little bit deeper about this, right? When we think about, oh my God, Lily says, I feel too guilty. Now I feel guilty for being too funny. Do you? I doubt that. I doubt that. So there's a process called individuation. I can go nerd out about it, but it really is about us coming into our own unique self, our one true self, our purpose, just realizing who we are. And so part of this process, as we begin to just see things from guilty or not guilty, or feelings of guilt or not feelings of guilt, we start to see how we are related to other people. And when we go through that process of feeling that guilt, it's about how we're responsible for our own suffering. It's about thinking about what role did we play in creating our own reality. And this opportunity makes us question how much we're responsible for, and when it comes to others, right? Because we are in sort of this like collective experience, sort of speak, right? Guilt for alone time and asking for what I need. Yeah, I feel like that's very common. I did a whole video about self-care that you can actually check out. It's called Stop Using Self-Care as a Band-Aid. And it's getting to the root of which I'm going to get into anyway, but getting to the root about the source of the guilt. Like, where's that guilt coming from? And go as far as you can to find the source. Because what is getting in the way of you asking for what it is that you truly want, right? Who are you impacting the most by not honoring that alone time, by not honoring what it is that you need? Because what's going to happen in the long run is, first of all, feeling that guilt does not feel good, right? And I'm going to share some stories, but that don't feel good. So you're carrying that heaviness right here, right? And then you're building resentment in the process and bitterness for not asking what you need. And a lot of times the reason that we don't do these things is because of confrontation. We're afraid that if we ask for what we need and say that we want these things, we sort of demand it, it's going to, people are going to abandon us because we decide to do that. So there's a sense of fear that is hidden underneath that sentence. And so I encourage you to just kind of like dig deep a little bit and see what's going on there, because what happens is we get really uncomfortable with confrontation. As Christine Hassett calls it, clarifying conversation, not confrontation. Yeah, that's a great question, Lily. I love that question. I use it for myself. Lily says, I always ask, whose voice is this? Is this my voice or someone else's? The minute you ask that question, you're like, oh, that's my mom. Oh, that's my dad. What's going on, Shake? Oh, that's so-and-so. That's the teacher from 4th grade or whatever. Ask yourself, whose voice is in my head right now? And do they even matter? Do they even matter? Okay. So some people who are constantly experiencing some of this guilt, they carry a lot of it on their shoulders. And so then you have other people who are like dodging that responsibility altogether. And this can either lead to piling guilt on themselves or pushing it onto others. And so it's like this complex dance, because, you all know about the guilt trips. I'm from the Caribbean. It's like certified guilt trippers. If you're from the Caribbean, oh my God. It took me a long time to move away from that family guilt. Wanting to individuate, right, from my core members of my family, wanting to do things different, people guilt tripping me for doing things different and going outside the norm. And I dealt with that for a long time. And it made it very hard because I would carry on that guilt. And eventually I was like, you know what? We're all living different lives. We might be here in this space together, but we're all living different lives. And I can't allow other people's fears to be projected on my experiences. And that's sort of how I move away from the family guilt. Because in the Haitian community, you be close to your family, visit, you have to visit them all the time. You got to do all these things. And there's like this level of commitment. And when I moved out of Massachusetts, it was like, I was like the blackest of the black sheep just by moving. So that guilt can actually keep you in circumstances and situations that are totally detrimental for your health, for your overall well-being on many facets, right? And sometimes we swap, we prefer to suffer at the expense of somebody else's comfort. And, you know, it took a while to grow out of that. And I encourage you to actually grow out of that yourself, because usually when people are guilt tripping you, it really comes down to them feeling as if they are abandoned. Like there's a level of fear there. And so the guilt tripping comes from a level of abandonment. So just keep that in mind. But, you know, the guilt also comes from like you feel like you did something wrong, right? Kind of like I shouldn't have done that, that I shouldn't have done that feeling. And we kind of avoid the consequences, quote unquote consequences, of those actions. And so some people wonder, like, okay, what's the difference between guilt and remorse? And when I think of remorse, it's really, guilt is like, ooh, I got caught, right? Like, damn, I shouldn't have got caught. If I didn't get caught, I wouldn't feel guilty, right? But remorse, though, is a lot deeper than that. It's when you really regret hurting somebody, when you really regret how your presence impacted the situation. And it has nothing to do with rules or breaking the rules. It's more about the person who's impacted by those actions or the words. And it's all about empathy, being able to have empathy for the other person that whatever the experience happened to. And it's also about relationships. Guilt sometimes can be about like rules and doing right or wrong, but deep remorse and feeling that remorseful is really about, oh, I really care about this relationship, right? And again, guilt is all about like being scared of being caught. And so remorse is what we hope to feel in certain circumstances, because it's through that remorse that we can actually find ways to heal some of that guilt, and also work through a lot of our relationships, right? What I want to move towards is the things that you can do if you are feeling consumed by guilt. I can go into like the whole source of guilt, which is one of those questions. It's like, when you're starting to feel guilty, how are you looking at it? I always ask that question. Okay, I'm feeling really guilty right now. And one of the things that for me, growing up, I grew up in a household where being quiet was a protective barrier for me, right? And so as long as I stayed quiet and I didn't get into a lot of trouble, I would avoid a lot of the drama and the shenanigans in the household. And so they started to call me like, oh, Frances is good. She's a good girl, all those things. And I took on that persona. I wasn't somebody that went to parties. I didn't do drugs. I didn't drink until college. So I kind of I skated by without getting too much, causing too much of a ruckus. But I think I adopted that over time, that like I had to be good so I wouldn't disappoint people. And so sometimes our feelings of guilt might be connected to unresolved issues or experiences from our childhoods. So you might be projecting these past feelings onto current situations, right? And one of the things I always tell my clients is like, go to the source. And once you found the source, go as far as you can from your earliest memories of like when you had this feeling and this experience. And it's really an opportunity for you to just sort of examine your perspective on guilt. Like, how am I looking at it? And from what place am I looking at it from? And then from there, you get to question your own personal viewpoint about it, right? And the source of the guilt. And then when you get to the source, that's when you can break all those things down, all those narratives. And so if we don't get a hold of this, we might continue to project our guilt onto others or external circumstances, all in the name of protecting our image, our self-image, that nice. And that's a whole nother conversation about like sort of like being the nice guy image. That too can cause a lot of problems. So you can find yourself avoiding as if like you did something wrong or morally questionable. And so being able to trace this back gives us an opportunity to accept that we did something, quote unquote, that was out of alignment. I don't like to use the word bad, but that this guilty situation, I'm also responsible for. We take ownership versus wanting to preserve our own innocence and holding on to sort of that positive image as it relates to causing a lot of havoc in our relationships. And another thing to do that's important is to make peace with the guilt. Okay, guilt is just like the pink elephant in the room. Okay, it's like you feel it, you sense it, you can actually see it on people's faces, right? And so come to terms with it, make peace with it, allow its presence to be present. And when we come to terms with the feelings of guilt, rather than try to resist them, rather than try to deny them, rather than try to suppress them, it gives us an opportunity to reconcile with this emotion. And because sometimes what we'll do whatever we can to not actually feel the guilt. And when we do that, that causes more suffering. And so we want to acknowledge it. We don't want to try to prevent it. We just want to know that this feeling is there. And so the next question, once you recognize the presence of guilt, you kind of just want to be like, okay, ask yourself, like, how do I deal with it on a normal basis, right? Well, what do I typically do? And if that feels familiar, then maybe we need to do something different. And sometimes some of us may not want to deal with it. We just shut down. Instead of addressing or processing some of this guilt in sort of like this healthy way, again, we might suppress it. And this can actually lead to emotional avoidance or detachment, right? If you're somebody, I don't know if you know too much about attachment styles, but if you're somebody who is what's it called? Avoidant attachment. Guilt is all in there. Guilt is all in there. But once you work through that, you're able to be more present with your emotions. And so you just want to make friends with it. Remember, guilt is that frenemy. It's the friend because it gives me the feedback. It can become the enemy when I allow it to consume me. So acknowledge its presence. And the more that we embrace guilt into our lives, although it's going to be uncomfortable, right? Because that's part of the growth process. We're encouraged to sort of just explore, get curious, to begin understanding it rather than just sort of push it away. And so the feelings of guilt, when they come up, and I'm wrapping up here, but when they come up is really a powerful opportunity to really use them as a learning tool, right? To progress on this journey. And if there's something that you've done that you really feel guilty about it, obviously check in with yourself and make sure that guilt is appropriate, because sometimes we are guilty of towards things that aren't even ours. Like we just take on the guilt. So make sure that you earnestly are responsible for whatever just happened. And then maybe this is an opportunity to atone for what has happened, right? Or what you did or didn't do. So this is an opportunity to self-correct. And through this atonement, it's really just about like making amends, confronting the guilt and having that sincere desire to make amends, to change the behavior. Because when you're committed to this process, things start to become more clear. Because sometimes, we might be doing things because we're just not clear on our values, right? We're not clear on what our boundaries are. And that what could also muddy the waters when it comes to understanding our relationship with guilt. And so once we get clear on some of those things, then we can actually work through our guilt with a bit more finesse. Okay. And so when you go through the process of getting to the source and healing your guilt, confronting and resolving some of this guilt will impact you on an emotional level. Like it will heal some of those emotional disruptions. And in the process, you get to the guilt, then you get to the cousins of shame, regret, the anxiety that might come up for you when you're feeling the guilt, right? And your life from there is just going to get better as a result. Because now you're also putting a bit of a sense of empowerment back into your life. Because now you're more empowered to take some action. But most importantly, working through the guilt helps you also deepen your level of empathy. It makes your relationships more powerful. And so take this opportunity not to, like I said earlier, don't take guilt as an opportunity for you to just beat on yourself, right? To just talk really badly about yourself, to shame on yourself, but use guilt as an opportunity to grow and expand, right? Because we can sit there and use all the energy to berate ourselves, or we can sit there, use the energy to learn from the situation and free ourselves from a lot of that suffering. Okay. So in the process, I'm gonna wrap it up and say, give yourself some grace, lots of compassion, kindness, and the most important thing though, forgive yourself first. Before you forgive anyone else, forgive yourself first, and then move through the process. So I hope this live was helpful. I'm here every Wednesday. Next week, I'll probably do this next Tuesday because I got some things planned. But make sure you join the Thrive newsletter so that we can continue this conversation offline. And I really appreciate y'all participating. If you have any questions about this, some of you, I've had you DM me a few times, but yeah, DM me, let me know, can continue the conversation there as well. And keep in touch. Have a good night. Mm-mm-mm.